že snemaš?
Ja, lahko že snemam. Ja,
Okay.
štima.
Okay, so let's do this.
Mogoče bi sam najavil, da se Ela joina na neki točki.
Kaj?
Da se Ela joina na neki točki. Ela praznik.
Ela praznik.
Ja.
Čekaj, ne štekam.
Pač posredoval se mi link. Upam, da ni bad. Pač sprašvala me, pač prej ni mogla se, pač na prejšnjo srečanje je imela neke stvari, ampak je ful zanimal ta Canguilhem, pa sem pač takrat posredoval link. Rekla, da se pridružim.
Okay. So do you see the main screen or do you see the second screen, right? Okay.
See the screen you would see.
Yeah. So do you see the main screen now? So
yes,
yeah.
the whole screen.
Okay. The second chapter of the second part. Actually, I would say that this is one of the more important parts. It continues what we left off last time. So where we left off last time continues where we left off last time, and it expands on some of the ideas that we have touched upon, primarily on the question of normality and anomaly. So Canguilhem points out that there is a certain ambiguity to the notion of normality. It is used in two different ways. So when it is usually used in two different ways. So it can either be understood as something that is factual or something that has a certain value. So as a value. So it is used either as that which is most common or as that which ought to be. Similarly, it is sometimes referred to something that is habitual, that is to say something that is regular and ordinary, and at other times it is understood as something that is ideal, so something that is optimal or excellent. In regards to this last distinction, Canguilhem points out that sometimes it is said that normality is something that is imposed from the outside, so there is a certain externality to it. And sometimes it is used as something that is inherent to life. So normality or the notion of normal is something that is determined by life itself. So it is internal to life. And as you know, Canguilhem defends this second segment. So he defends these second understanding, second conceptions of normality. So that the notion of normal is not a fact but a value. It's not habitual but ideal. It's not external but internal. And then he goes on to elaborate on that. So the crucial point in this particular segment is that life is a dynamic polarity. This is a notion that keeps repeating in this segment. So life is that which is not indifferent to the conditions in which it is possible. So he uses this phrase as a synonym for normative activity. Namely, life is also that which establishes norms. So there is a certain inherent polarity to life, which makes life a phenomenon whereby matter matters to it. So there is a certain mattering to life. As I've said before, it is not indifferent to the conditions in which it is possible. Here are some random quotes on this. Life is far removed from such an indifference to the conditions which are made for it. Life is polarity. The simplest biological nutritive system of assimilation and excretion expresses a polarity. There is no biological indifference, and consequently we can speak of biological normativity. even for an amoeba, living means preference and exclusion. So there is this preference and exclusion that is inherent to the living. It is polarized, so to speak. When he goes on to expound on this notion of dynamic polarity of life, he points out that life is related to vital need. So there is a permanent and essential vital need that is present in life. And this vital need is related to self-maintenance, development, and growth. So this would be somehow related to, for example, what in the later Varela's autopoietic theory is understood as this tendency of life towards self-maintenance and self-development. Canguilhem says that this vital need expresses itself, manifests itself in reactions of hedonic value, of self-healing, or self-restoring. So there are these behaviors that can be observed in living beings, and these are the manifestations or expressions of this vital need, which is associated or linked with the polarity, the dynamic polarity of the living. And this vital normativity, says Canguilhem, is an epistemological fact. So it is not something that is projected onto, say, a mechanical interplay of phenomena, but it is something that is inherent to life, and it's something that needs to be taken seriously, in the sense of that it cannot be simply brushed away as a projection or a construction. He says that biological pathology exists, but there is no physical or chemical or mechanical pathology. So if you want to understand the living, you have to take into account this vital normativity or polarity if you want to understand these phenomena correctly. And he gives up a really nice example of the buildup of waste in a living organism. And he says that even though this process does not in any way is not in opposition to physical laws, it is in opposition to biological norms. So there is no breach in physical laws, yet still the organism dies. And this is something that is bad for the organism, and which eventually brings forth a specific set of behaviors, which can be only understood if you take vital normativity, that is to say, the dynamic polarity of life, seriously as a fundamental epistemological fact. So this vital normativity, he says, carves up a new point of view or a new territory in what might be called a physical plenum. This is quite similar to what you find in Merleau-Ponty, for example, when he speaks in phenomenology of perception or the structure of behavior, where he points out that this power of projection opens up a new point of view or new domain in what has previously been a physical plenum. So this new point of view or new territory is related precisely to life as normativity. So again, it is not the case that you simply have a given fact that is somehow neutral, that is, say, something that is maybe a statistical regularity, and then you project your normative judgment onto that, but there is a normativity that is inherent in the living phenomenon. It is life itself, says Canguilhem, and not medical judgment, which makes the biological norm concept of value and not a concept of statistical reality. For the physician, life is not an object, but rather a polarized activity. So physician, when he studies life, he studies it primarily as a polarized activity. Secondarily, he might use certain other techniques, and he can construe it, say, from a specific mechanical or a statistical point of view, but primarily it is a polarized activity. This new point of view, what I've mentioned earlier, is that of vital normativity. Even for an amoeba, living means preference and exclusion. I've already mentioned this one. A function does not work indifferently in several directions. A need places the proposed objects of satisfaction in relation to propulsion and repulsion. There is a dynamic polarity of life. Now, a question emerges here, whether we're not here dealing with a version of anthropomorphism. So, for example, when one might say, well, you know, there is this idea of vis medicatrix naturae, so life as a medical activity. And Canguilhem poses a question, aren't we here dealing with what Bergson called an illusion of retroactivity? So you somehow introduce or project human utilities and goals onto pre-human activity. But Canguilhem argues that this is not the case, so that you have you don't have this sequence where you have theory, that is to say medicine, and then you apply it in technology, and then you can somehow project this into life, but that life as such is polarity. It is related to the vital needs, that is to say, to the behaviors of self-maintenance and self development. And this polarity then also manifests itself in technology or technique in human beings, that is to say in therapeutics. So the therapeutic activities are basically an extension of these fundamental vital behaviors that are aimed at self-preservance, self-maintenance, and self-development. And this then eventually leads to theory. So there is a certain, this is not a retroactive illusion. Instead, already in the fundamental activity of information and assimilation, so in the fundamental organic activity, there is a root of all technology, as he says, so of technical activity. Human technique, he says, extends vital impulses at whose service it tries to place systematic knowledge, which would deliver them from much of life's costly trial and error. So basically what systematic knowledge is a way of, in a certain sense, optimizing trial and error techniques. And in this sense, although he does not really expand on this, or he does not develop it in great depth, it is in a certain sense a further complexification of these types of techniques, I would assume. Now, another question that he raises is the question of anomality and abnormality, where he says that usually in the standard view, the notions of abnormal and anomalous are synonymous. But according to Canguilhem, this is not the case. He says that abnormal is something that is related to pathology and disease, whereas anomalous is more neutral in its meaning. So it basically expresses variety and divergence. And this is important because of what we've been saying so far. So why? Because anomaly becomes abnormality from the point of view of the living being or patient. So I'll read this quote. It's somewhat longer than the previous ones, but I think it's worth of reading in full. As long as the morphological or functional variations on the specific type do not hinder or subvert this polarity, the anomaly is a tolerated fact. In the opposite case, the anomaly is felt as having negative vital value and is expressed as such on the outside. Because there are anomalies which are experienced or revealed as an organic disease, there exists first an effective and then a theoretical interest in them. It is because the anomaly has become pathological that it stimulates scientific study. The scientist, from his objective point of view, wants to see the anomaly as a mere statistical divergence, ignoring the fact that the biologist's scientific interest was stimulated by the normative divergence. So, not all anomalies are pathological, but only the existence of pathological anomalies has given rise to a special science of anomalies, and so on and so forth. So why is this important? Because what we've said about normality and normal prior to this is also related to what I've just said about anomaly and abnormality. So you have abnormalities from the point of view of a living being, and the living being being the vehicle of life, which again is a polarized activity. So a certain anomaly, which is merely, as I've said, a variation, becomes something that is pathological from the point of view of a living being. And he says that anomaly originally is basically a spatial multiplicity. This is very interesting because he kind of relates this neutral divergence, this neutral variety to spatiality. So you have different configurations of different organisms, and they can be neutral as long as these organisms are capable of living in a specific environment. So they basically are an expression of a variety. Whereas abnormality is a break in a chronological succession. So he links abnormality to temporality, because you actually start living a different way of, you enter into a different mode of existence when you become sick. And this relates not only in relation to the others, because others kind of perceive you as sick, but also in relation to yourselves. Your previous self, your previous mode of being becomes, in a certain sense, inaccessible. So abnormality interrupts a course, as Canguilhem says, and introduces another mode of being. And he gives several examples of infirmity and debility, fragility, which basically mean exactly this, so that there is this limitation to the normativity of life, where your ability to express norms in as many different environments as possible is limited. Another point that he makes is that so the question about whether a given anomaly is merely a variety or abnormality, so whether it is an invention, he says that basically every anomaly can be at the same time the beginning of a new species. So how do you know if there is a certain mutation, whether this mutation is something that will prove to be pathological or something that will potentially lead to the creation or development of a new species? And he says that what is important here is that you have to take into account that the designation of normality is not related to organism in isolation, nor is it related to environment in isolation, but only in the dialectical interrelationship between organism and environment. So only if you consider both organism and environment can you talk about normality or use the notion of normal. So taken separately, the living being and his environment are not normal. It is their relationship that makes them such. An interesting definition of species. So species for Canguilhem is the grouping of individuals whose unity expresses the momentary normalization of their relationship with the environment. So basically, the grouping of individuals that somehow as a whole express momentary normalizations of the relationship with the environment. And if a specific anomaly or a mutation is introduced, it can be either abnormal, neutral, or optimal. So it can be within the realm of species if it's neutral, I guess. It can be abnormal if it's substandard in a certain sense, and optimal if it's above the standard. And this can basically lead eventually into development of a new species. And he gives two examples that we can get into later on, perhaps. Drosophila and butterflies. So I'll just mention the second one because I find it a bit more interesting. So there was a specific area, I think, in England where they used to live a certain species of butterflies, which were predominantly gray. And then after a while, as the area became more industrialized, these gray varieties started dying out, and the black ones became more prominent. And the thing is that he says that the reason for this was that because of the industrialization of the area, more birds were dying there, and therefore the black variety, which is in general more active than the gray one, could kind of spread more easily. So you had two diametrically opposed features. So you had gray butterflies who were more passive, and black who were more active. And for example, the black variety would also overpopulate the gray one in the laboratory setting. But in the open, where there was enough birds, it was more easily spotted, so it wasn't able to prevail, so to speak. But as the environment changed, this black variety became more prominent. So butterflies were able to be black with impunity in this particular in this particular environment. So again, it was the what constituted a norm and which variety becomes abnormal in a specific setting is determined also in the environmental context. And given the fact that both change, so both the organisms and the environment change, this is something that is very dynamic, and it's, again, I would say one of these dynamical processes that tends to change. Okay, so one last thing here, yes, is that for what has just been said, Canguilhem says that there are no normal facts that would exhaust the norm. So normal facts are but expressions or manifestations of a norm, which somehow embodies or manifests itself in this dynamic exchange between the organism and its environment. And somehow, if I understood him correctly, you cannot really, so one thing here is that it is the normativity of the living being. So it is the vital norm that determines which facts are normal. And also the facts themselves do not somehow circumscribe the normality, because a given fact can, in a different setting, become something that is completely irrelevant for that particular organism. So it is only against this broader background that a certain fact, a certain individual fact, that becomes normal. So facts do not determine norms or normality. The living being as a normative being determines what counts as a normal fact. And this is important for several reasons. We can go into this later on. Okay, one final thing that Canguilhem asks here is if what we've just said is true, so that the normality is related to the exchange or the dynamical Auseinandersetzung between the organism and its environment, then what does this say about these attempts of studying, say, certain normal parameters in a laboratory setting? So you want to study certain physiological normal parameters in a specific setting. And Canguilhem basically brings forth a set of issues that we've already seen in both Merleau-Ponty and in Goldstein, where he points out why the attempts of laboratory standardization can be problematic. To begin with, these are artificially stabilized conditions. So if it is true that different conditions bring forth different norms, here what you're studying is basically laboratory norms. Why? Because you introduce the organism in a very specific setting where you really monitor that specific circumstances in the environment are kept constant. And these circumstances that are kept constant, that are then basically forgotten or put aside. They're not crucial, but they actually are, because they form a whole that impacts the result. The only thing is that because you're keeping them constant, you're kind of allowed to artificially forget about them. But the fact is that what you're studying is a specific, very specific environment, which will produce specific factual results when you study the organism. What is more is that if statistically divergent and usual conditions are abnormal for the organism, then laboratory conditions are by definition pathological, that is to say suboptimal for the organism. So by you studying the organism in the laboratory setting, you're not basically studying normality as such. You're studying a specific adaptation or a specific set of adaptations that could be deemed in this suboptimal condition. And finally, there are many practical issues that are related to standardization, issues that are normally not addressed either on a theoretical or on the pragmatical level. First off, what the experimenter has to take care of and actually provide good reasons for is that normal subject is in fact the same in experimental situation and in situations. So that, for example, the experimenter or the researcher can meaningfully extrapolate findings from the experimental situation onto normal situations, which can be problematic given what we've said in number 1 and number 2. Then the second thing is that the researcher has to take care of the fact that pathological state is the same in experimental situation and in normal situation, which is again problematic, so that artificially induced changes are basically the same as spontaneous pathological changes that occur in normal situations. And then also what needs to be addressed is the potential incommensurability between these points that were brought forth in the last two sections. So basically the idea that the normal subject in the experimental situation and in the normal situation is the same phrase used in very different ways, so that the meaning of the normal subject is completely different in these situations, and the same holds true for pathological state. And if this is the case, then it is dubious what this means for the studies, laboratory studies. And basically the underlying point that Canguilhem is making here is that whenever an observer is trying to study something, he influences the observed. So the observational techniques are interferences and they change the phenomenon you want to study. So the point that quantum physicists were making is something that's been very well known by people who are studying living beings, so biologists and say psychologists. So, and these interferences are far from trivial, although they are often treated as such. That's the presentation. Here are some topics for discussion. So first point would be what is the relevance of different points of view or standpoints? So physician as a scientist versus a physician as a living being. So physician who's trying to implement statistical and mechanical methodologies, and a living being, a physician as a living being who is himself a manifestation or an embodiment of vital needs and norms. Then the question about laboratory studies. So what exactly it is we're studying in the lab. Abundance of life. This is something I've already mentioned. So the variations of life that are brought forth in different organisms, and then in human beings, having, instead of real-time variations, virtual variations that are part of the reflective procedure. And then also the question of the nature of norm. So what exactly does it mean that norm is something that is ideal, and what it means that it has a specific historicity, so the fact that it seems to change over time, and how one can basically study it. Yeah, so that's that. So any comments or questions?
I don't know, concerning like vital normativity, I think I generally understand and would mostly agree, but I didn't get I didn't see any concrete arguments concerning like how he understands this, where this normativity comes from. Like maybe if you could, do you see like a connection with homeostasis, or maybe autopoiesis, or concepts such as these, or how do you see it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that with Canguilhem, the impression I have is that he's the type of, he's a thinker who usually does not really provide positive accounts in the sense of trying to necessarily build up either an account or some sort of an exposition or what have you, as Merleau-Ponty would do, for example. He is just kind of looking at the specific gaps in the prevailing theory and trying to bring forth certain problems that are inherent to this theory. And for example, he introduces the notion of normativity and polarity in light of his historical studies of the development of the classical physiological account. So the attempt to make medicine, say, objective and based on certain statistical techniques and so on and so forth. And he kind of points to the fact that in order for you to be able to apply these techniques, you already somehow have to have some sort of an understanding of what life is, how it manifests itself, and so on and so forth. But I don't really have the impression that he provides a positive account of, say, what vital normativity is, how you should go about understanding it. For me, it seems more like an initial reflection, some sort of a stepping stone. I think I've mentioned this previously, but I think this is the reason why, for example, my friend Charles Wolfe is so fond of Canguilhem, but he really detests Merleau-Ponty. Because, you know, he, in a certain sense, he would like to have a critique of reductionism / mechanicism or what have you on the cheap. So you have a critique, but you don't necessarily have to commit yourself to any new metaphysical alternative, what have you. Because Canguilhem allows you to do so. Of all the authors we've covered so far, I think he's the one that gives you most leeway with regards to this. He's the one author. From the perspective of ancient philosophy, he would be, you know, the Pyrrhonic skeptic. He's the guy who kind of tries to gets you in, he tries to get you into a corner without necessarily trying to then show you this is the way you should, you know, think. He doesn't do that from what I gather. So he will try to flesh out a little bit more the whole notion of polarity and normativity and normality, but it's more like I don't even know. It's more like trying to introduce the notion of norm into life sciences or medicine in general, but not really expounding it. Perhaps even in a certain sense, maybe somehow showing that you cannot truly expound it, that it's somehow a primitive. I don't know. I don't know. You will also remember, for example, from Goldstein, right? He was also having this strange position when you didn't really know where he was at. So he might still say something like vital normativity or vital polarity is an epistemological fact. And then if you pressed him, he would just say, look, I don't know, you know, this is a medical PhD. This is, I'm basically developing a methodological and epistemological track. Don't push me into philosophizing or, you know, transgressing any further boundaries. This is as far as I'm willing to go. I'm basically trying to show the medical people that they have to take normativity of life as, yeah, as an epistemological primitive, so to speak. Now, you know, you can go into a debate as to what this means from a philosophical perspective, but given the fact that this was in fact medical treatise, he might say, this is where I draw the line in this particular text.
Actually, in the introduction to section 1, he explicitly states that he's not going to renovate medicine and to act as a historian of medicine. So I think it has more to do with what he calls like pseudo-philosophical literature in medicine and pseudo-medical literature in philosophy.
Yes, and he even says something like that he has sacrificed enough to the demon of philosophy or something like that in this treatise. So he kind of points out that maybe judging from the perspective of most PhDs that were written in the realm of medicine, he's done way more philosophy than is usually done. I think that could be part of the answer.
But I'm not missing a philosophical account, maybe more of a technical medical account. Like that's something I'm specifically missing in this chapter. Like there's a lot of philosophizing going on about how the environment determines the organism and vice versa. But like just like what the norm actually looks like in terms of the organism, like that's something that isn't quite clear to me.
I think
it looks like, I mean, what it's consists of.
I think that what he would basically say is if he knew something like the autopoietic theory of the organism or something similar to that, he would probably say, you see, this is a way better model to account for life, because it takes this so this polarity seriously, in the sense of it tries to incorporate it into the theory itself, and it kind of builds it from that. So it's closer to the source of the problem that he's trying to point out. I don't think that he has a model in mind. And I'm not even sure that this is something he wants to portray. It's more like, so the general idea, I think, is the following. I'm going to give you a historical account where you see the development of a certain attitude in medicine. So how a certain ideal of how medicine is supposed to be done has developed. And then I'm going to try to show why this doesn't work. And I'm going to point out certain moments or notions that I think are missing from the picture, but I'm not really developing an alternative account in the sense of maybe, you know, the theory of autopoietic, of theory of life or something like that. So I think that this is outside of his purview, so to speak.
I actually, I don't think this is a good interpretation, because he explicitly states that he's not a historian of medicine, that the history he does is just for purposes of intelligibility. So I think it doesn't, I mean, it's weirdly written, because you always, when I read it, I always think, okay, what is this positive theory? What could he say? Kind of some important concrete points that he could make about the normative concept in medicine. But what to me seems more and more clear is that he doesn't want to do that because he thinks medicine by itself stands as a technique, and when it's kind of when it's in its flow state, it manages to function as technique. I read it more of a critique, as a critique of some kind of political interpretations of certain medical texts, and for example, philosophy of health, which still relies very much on statistical interpretations. So I wouldn't say he's trying to renovate or do a certain biological medical treatise here. It's more kind of cultural, the history of ideas, than the history of medicine. So I don't think the concept of normal is so important within medicine for him as it is how it functions in the kind of external milieu of medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I would completely buy what you just said. No, I actually wouldn't know. I mean, it's definitely true that these are segments that are present there, and that maybe also in the later text he moves more in that direction. But this is still very much focused both on medicine as such, and also, but I will grant you, and I think maybe this is something you were aiming at, is that he's trying to point out how, for example, the ideas in medicine are interpenetrated also with the ideas that are outside of medicine, and how they shape, and how this is then interrelated, and this will definitely play a role. But I think that this is basically a question of different emphasis. So what you or I are saying, we would probably both agree that he is not trying to provide an alternative account, say, in the sense of trying to erect a theory, right? That a historical dimension has an important role in his account, because he tries to he doesn't try theory in the narrow sense, history in the narrow sense of the term, but history in the sense of trying to show the genesis of a specific something that then becomes like embedded as a norm and functions as an ideal that is usually implicitly presupposed. For example, the ideal of objective medicine, or the ideal that you can provide a statistical account of disease or of normality or what have you, that this is not something that just fell out of the sky. It has a certain genesis, and it's far from trivial, this genesis and the whole process. And then eventually he does, as we will see, kind of bring into question how this is then interrelated also to the other segments. But the way you're trying to read him, I have the impression you're kind of try to Foucault Canguilhem, which is something that many people do. I'm not really sure I buy that, and I don't really think is necessarily very productive, or I don't understand this, or maybe the way you talk about this technique, I simply don't get. Because this is something that you constantly bring up, and
yeah, I'm not clear about my reading either, but just when I read it, when I'm now reading it second time through, as I was preparing the presentation of the introduction, I really I didn't notice that he stresses really, I mean, he stresses a lot that he's not kind of doing medicine here. It's just like certain methodological concepts which are informed with medical information. So, and then
yeah,
also,
that's a good point. That's a valid point. I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. of course, I don't know how to articulate that clearly as of now, but I can feel Timi with this kind of what he means when he is emphasizing the lack of a positive account. But I think that precisely this is something that he thinks is not useful, I would say.
I mean, he explicitly states that the sick person defines his own norm of health. So when you say something like that, it seems to me that you are making a medical claim, or at least like a philosophical claim about the individual person's experience or just a state of disease, right? It's not a claim about the social context of the disease, at least not straight away. I mean, I think in part he wants to have like this kind of a positive account. At least it seems to me.
I would more emphasize, for example, kind of creativity of normativity, that there's a certain negative character to a norm, so that you can just show that a certain objectification of a norm does not function, but the other way, so a positive implication of a certain style of life is impossible, I would probably.
I would agree with Timothy that I think he does want to give a positive account. He's just not very good at it. And I think, or maybe it's kind of part of the tradition where he's coming from, which, I don't know, if you read Foucault, for example, I think you have the similar situation of constant historiography, giving examples throughout history of certain phenomena, but then it never really gets to anywhere to any positive point. That, at least that was my experience with Foucault, and you really have to read into it to get these more specific theories out of it.
Yeah, but here I would basically back up Isaac's claim, and I would reiterate what I've said. I don't think this is true. I think that he is very explicit about this in the introductory part, where he emphasizes that the main point that he will be doing is methodological and conceptual in a certain sense. Not conceptual in the analytic philosophy sense, but more in the in the sense that is more typical of French historical epistemology, where you have this historical notion and the development of the concept. So at least in this particular treatise, he is trying to be primarily methodological. So not so much theoretical in the sense of erecting an alternative. It's more, and maybe I think that Isaac is maybe onto something when he says that that's not even something that he would find useful. He doesn't provide a definitive answer with regards to this. I always had the impression as if he kind of tried to leave this open, so he might return to this sometime. So he didn't really want to commit himself either way, but he did narrow down the scope of what he was trying to do. The question is, of course, maybe this is something that that developed as he was writing on this, while he was developing this. So maybe he did originally want to do something more than this, but then he says something of the kind, but I forget, something like, I don't know, I won't be able to remember now. Yeah, we can stick with this, or we can go to some other topics as well.
I mean, because I'm not entirely sure, what does it mean that when you say that what he's doing is just methodological? I mean, he is trying to advance a certain view of normality and pathology. I don't think that's just methodological. That's a pretty concrete thing he's trying to expound upon. So what does it mean that it's just methodological? I think he still has to define more clearly what does it mean for a living thing to be normative. Whereas he just keeps saying, okay, it is normative, there's this vital normativity, and just keeps dancing around the concept.
Yeah, what basically that means is that you can show how some of the accepted ways of doing and understanding things are basically circular, and they presuppose what they actually claim to be able to show, and writing a PhD thesis on that alone is enough. So already by doing that, you're kind of making a methodological and epistemological claim, because you're kind of constantly, you know, and Canguilhem is being very, very concrete in this. So he's like constantly throwing out examples of diseases and and he will be doing that throughout the whole text. So he's, I think, using several accounts where he's constantly making this point where, you know, if you try to use statistical means to explicate the normativity, vital normativity, you're kind of running in circles, because what you're doing is you are presupposing already the normativity that you're claiming to be expounding. And he's kind of trying to show this in very different ways, how and why this is the case. So, you know, if you think about it from a strictly pragmatic perspective, you have to write a 100 to 200 page treatise for your PhD. This is like, you know, a very well structured thing that you want to do in those within that context. Maybe go to something else, not necessarily to this.
I'm gonna ask a question because I don't understand. I think Timothy asked the same question last time, but I don't remember the answer. So with the question of techniques, are we, or does Canguilhem or any one of you understand techniques are something that is in nature, so that nature is actually replete with techniques, or is techniques like a species of practical reasoning, and that would mean that techniques is something unnatural that only human does? Because I think with Canguilhem, techniques it's something that can be found in nature, and I think that maybe I'm understanding him wrong. So it's just a question if anyone would like to answer.
What do you mean found in nature? Could you clarify that?
Yes. When we were talking in email about techniques as externalization of memory and so on, I think that this is some kind of unnatural technique, something that creates artificial things like it. But when you're thinking about, I think with Canguilhem, there are like life techniques, like something that nature possesses as such. But I think that I'm more on the side that techniques are like this unnatural thing that human does, and because of that we cannot compare human activities with all the other life forms. That is my problem.
I see, although I don't really see the connection between your question and mine, or maybe I remember to. I still don't quite understand. Maybe so, if anybody else.
Yes, basically in this chapter I have a problem that I'm not sure if Canguilhem I think that human life form is a bit different than other life forms because it is capable of, you know, reflecting the world, recognizing, because of this feedback loop that is actually unnatural in a sense, because it's always creating, it's interpreting the world as it is. Other life forms don't do that, but still.
So that would be practical reason
this,
on your account?
Yes, that would be.
But what's specific
yes,
to humans? Yeah, okay.
Yes, and that's why, you know, humans can, you know, do stuff like they can, you know, we can commit suicide and don't follow the natural rules or whatever. It's just my problem that I don't think we can. I mean, I personally don't agree that human life form and life form as such are the same. That is basically my problem. And if we mix this together, that then we are kind of in a space where we presuppose things that shouldn't be presupposed.
Yeah. I don't think, Enea, that Canguilhem would necessarily defend this view. So just because he's trying to connect a link between a technique and the organic or the vital, it would not necessarily follow from this that there are no further, say, diversifications or, say, even qualitative jumps in development of different life forms. The reason why I'm saying this is because in some of his later texts, he does introduce the notion of knowledge as something that is a part of a similar dynamics. So the organism trying to cope with its environment, but it does so in a way that is very different, because knowledge basically allows you to transcend or step away from experience in the sense of being submerged into the experience. But let me try to still say what I think that he's trying to do. He's trying to say the following. He's trying to show how there is a route to technical activity in there's a route to technical activity in the very dynamics of the living, in the very dynamics of the organic. So because technique is usually something that interferes in a way that has a certain means or ends or purpose or expresses a certain matter ring, and this is something that can be done, according to him, by the living structure, by the structures that are not neutral with regards to their environment. So where there is this polarity. So he would say the following: if you want to understand the genesis of, say, a technique properly, and also somehow the genesis or genealogy of knowledge in the broadest sense possible, you need to take this into account. Because if you disregard this, what happens is you end up with the Cartesian picture where you have a fully formed knowledge of the human being and a dead matter. And that's basically it. And you never basically can bring them together. You kind of can create these, intermittent links, but you don't really have a good way of relating them. And according to Canguilhem, the notion of living is a very, very important intermediary chain link, which is usually ignored because it is simply lumped together with, say, inanimate matter. But if you take into account that living itself is already such a qualitative jump in a certain sense, which has a specific dynamics, you can start developing a really interesting story there. And then when you get to the level of human beings where knowledge proper develops, you might have a further complexification, which might even, again, be related to a qualitative jump. But for you to be able to understand how this, got going, you need this, which doesn't necessarily, again, exclude the fact that you can develop an account where human technology and human knowledge that is related to this technology is qualitatively different from what the other organisms are doing. So this is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, I don't know if does this at least partly answer the question?
Yeah. I think you basically said that in Canguilhem, he would say that nature is in fact replete with techniques and some kind of hierarchy can then form and so on. Okay, yes, thank you.
So yeah, it is replete with techniques, but yeah, it also depends what techniques here means, and this also probably opens up a question that was brought forth by people who were working on this Varela and Maturana's notion, of life as autopoiesis and all that, where there was this thesis put forward that living is cognizing. So that already at the realm of living, you have a certain fundamentally, like a certain rudimentary phenomenon of cognition. Now you can take this on board or not, but what might have been problematic also in there is this notion of knowledge. When we talk about knowledge, what do we mean by knowledge? What do we mean by cognition? And you already said, like, there's a practical knowledge, a practical cognition, and then you might wonder, is this necessarily something that's related solely to human beings? Well, maybe not, right? But there is something that happens, it would seem. I would definitely agree with you on this one, that there is a certain something that occurs here, which is in a significant sense different, even qualitatively different. So
yeah,
yes,
about that, maybe just an elaboration, like precisely if you mean by techniques like practical reason in general, then you could say that it's not really specific to humans. Like it's, at least it seems obvious to me that it's not. And more specifically, if you mean usage of tools or something like that, then things could be, I mean, it could be argued, yeah, that it is specific. But exactly, like, yeah, what Sebastjan said about like the notion of autopoiesis, yeah, at least if you buy this model, then all like life as such has ingrained in it some kind of practical reason, such that it can survive under circumstances that it perceives and stuff like that.
He does actually discuss this. He compares human technique with vital techniques on page 130. And I think he sort of tries to discuss whether we can look at human techniques as extensions of vital techniques. And at this point he says, because life is activity of information and assimilation, it is the root of all technical activity. So yeah, he definitely, and the way I understand it is that life is full of techniques, which are basically ways for the organism to, I don't know, establish its norm.
There was actually some research done. It was a long time ago when I read it, but that there's a certain mechanism in bacteria which gets triggered when they're exposed to high concentrations of antibiotics, and actually they kind of speed up the mutation rate, so that when bacteria proliferate, the mutations are far more numerous than when they just proliferate without the antibiotic environment.
I would jump in here. This is very interesting. So what happens in bacteria? This is very interesting. What you get is you get a higher proliferation of organisms, right? But in human beings, what happens is when you're confronted with this, you have a higher proliferation of virtual possibilities. So you don't have a direct proliferation of concrete different beings of varieties of the same theme, but you have a variety of the same theme happening in the virtual realm. So you basically can produce different selves and kill them off without necessarily killing them off. So there is a similar pattern, but it's of a different nature. You don't really have to produce all of this manifestly, but you can produce it virtually. This I find interesting. I will add a quote by Canguilhem into a chat. It's taken from a short text of his that's called Thought and Living. How fitting. And what he says here is, thought is nothing but a disentangling of man from the world that permits us to retreat from, to interrogate and to doubt, to think is the way, in the face of obstacles that arise. In concrete terms, knowledge consists in the search for security via the reduction of obstacles. It consists in the construction of theories that proceed by assimilation. It is thus a general method for the direct or indirect resolution of tensions between man and milieu. So even though in human beings you still have the same dynamics of the organism and its environment, and they're trying to kind of find a certain equilibrium, what happens is that there is, what gets introduced is this ability to pause. So this ability to pause, where you kind of open up, basically you have a domain of virtuality somehow opening up, where different possibilities are somehow there without necessarily having to be manifest real time, so to speak. I don't know, I find this idea very, very intriguing. I don't really know how to spell it out. I have a vague sense that it has to do with technology and technique. Again, I cannot really articulate it at this point, but there is a certain very similar structural parallel, at least it seems to me, that what happens is that a certain dynamics that is present in life is embedded into a certain new domain or place, if you like, and this is something that is then called the mental. So yeah, I don't know, it's a very, it's not even a half-baked idea, it's 1/10 baked idea at this point. I just find this parallel very intriguing, and I think there's more to it, and it could be kind of spelled, if it could be spelled out nicely, it could be potentially useful. We've touched upon this briefly before, right?
I just wanted to add something, because I don't know why maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I don't think this is something this fucking shit. Sorry. This chapter I didn't find so hard to understand because I don't know. I don't think there's. It's so hard to understand. Isn't all he's trying to say that we mustn't do the thing that the science would want to do? We shouldn't impose normativity onto nature, because nature has its own normativity, and it has its own normativity in the dynamics of a being and the environment, and all we're doing is not including the environment in our research or our conceptions. And I mean, it really reminds me of something, because I was studying Spinoza, and he talks about perfection and imperfection, and he says these are just things we came up while constructing general ideas, and then it seems as if in nature imperfection and perfection also exist, but that is only because our general ideas were imposed upon nature itself. as if we were trying to say that nature has done something wrong and we're here to fix it. I don't know. I think that's the only thing he's trying to say, and I don't think that this vital normativity is so hard to understand. It's something that I don't think really needs that much explanation. I don't think it's hard to understand that. I'm not trying to be here nothing. Just because it's plainly obvious. I think that maybe at least I was thinking about a human as being different from other beings, but that's only insofar as maybe I think the quality of man is something that we can, in a way, we can impose ourselves on the environment, but not in a way that would be, I don't know. It's because while doing Asian philosophy and getting to know the Hindu tradition, I think this mindfulness or something I'm trying to say that I think a man is different from other beings, though I think he still remains in the same vital normativity. So the being and the environment together form a dynamic duo. But I think, as opposed to other beings, he can make a more productive movement against the environment, or something like that. I think because like the butterflies were the environment seems to be imposed more upon them as the other way around. So something like that. But I don't think that's so hard to understand, the vital normativity he's trying to just the positive examples.
Yeah, I think that, look, Mattia, what you were saying, so maybe one way of kind of using what you've said and trying to cash it in some of the terms that I was proposing earlier on is, with other life forms, it would seem that life imposes itself on the environment by basically producing a massive amount of variations, which for the most part have to die off eventually. Whereas with human beings, you can impose yourself on the environment by producing a mass amount of virtual variations, and this gives you a very strong and very powerful leeway where you do in fact are able to like leave a massive imprint. And I think that the way you can produce these virtual possibilities is through technology. Technology is what opens up various possibility and kind of opens up new and new layers of possibilities of virtual realms. So you kind of open up several possibilities, you do something, you sometimes mess up, sometimes it works, and then when it works, this kind of becomes integrated as a part of you and opens up new possibilities of thinking about similar problems. So there's like in human beings, this proliferation of life happens within a given organism, whereas prior to that, you actually need to create a massive amount of organisms that have to die off. So the only way that nature does this is, again, so it can impose itself only by, so the life can impose itself in this way. In human beings, it imposes itself in different way. And this is something that could be then called mentality, where you have a similar dynamics acted out in a very different way and an extremely efficient way, which kind of opens up a very different environment in general.
I agree.
Look, another way of thinking about it is the following. If you have say, a certain species of crabs, and then you have these multitudes of little crabs that go towards the water, and 98% of them die off, okay? And each of these little crabs lives in his own Umwelt, yeah? So they're all in their own, as Uexküll would say, their own bubble, their own domain of signification, which is different because they're organized slightly differently, and they have slightly different behavioral patterns, and they are different worlds. Yeah, in human beings, where you have virtual possibilities, this also means that you yourself are living in a very different environment, because these different realities that have to embody themselves in very specific variations in other living beings are embodied in you. And because this is so, your Umwelt is no longer Umwelt, but becomes a Welt. That is to say, a world where things have different sides, when they have different meanings, when they have different dimensions and objects. So in a certain sense, a crab would not live in the world of things, so to speak. Only if you're capable of this proliferation of different possible selves can you live in the world of things. Yeah.
I have a funny idea now. I think maybe we can, I don't know, I think I talked about this already because it's something I do, but maybe if we imagine that the environment, no, it's something goes wrong. So the dynamic between me and the environment is somehow distorted, and I need to establish a new normativity, yes? But maybe I don't have to do it with my physiology. I can do it mentally. I can think of myself as a literary character inside of the environment, and though my physiognomy might change, I still perceive myself in a normative situation of my imagination, of my fantasy. Is that something you find intriguing? I think I do. I think
this is something that
yes.
would be very much in line with what I've said.
Exactly. Yes.
So for example, creating the fictional worlds or these virtual realities, so to speak, would be one way of enacting this. Then another way would be of maybe also partly imitating not necessarily people who are in front of you, but just, you know, so look, this opens up a whole plethora of possibilities then, and it's just like something that exponentially grows once you enter. So it would be like this: if a given organism somehow stumbled into this possibility by opening up the domain of technology, once you get into it, it's just like from this you get into an exponential development of this. It's just, you know, one of those things that kind of opens up to so many new possibilities. This is why I said when I said to Enea that it's still possible to have something that is genealogically is related to life in general, but at a certain level of complexification, it kind of acquires new qualities. And this is something that Canguilhem constantly points out, so that even if you have a quantitative continuation, you might still have qualitative jumps. So, yeah. See that you're not really, except for Mattia, other people are not really enthused by this idea. I find it fascinating, but just
I actually find it
I
quite
have some problems with yeah, I think we have similar problems. So maybe you go ahead.
Okay, basically what I would say is that I find problematic this notion of virtual self, in this sense that I think that one, if I take your example of literary characters, Mattia, it's not that I'm myself and then I find a literary character and I try to kind of imagine myself within him or in his shoes. It's more that in my everyday life, there are certain kind of forces which propel me in a similar manner as do the forces that kind of propel the literary character in the novel. So kind of it's first that I act as a literary character, and then kind of in the second step, I realize that I've been acting like him all along. So that the virtual self arrives after I'm already performing, after I've already killed other supposedly virtual selves. In the same way as you gave the example with crabs, it's not only up to the sufficiency of certain normative dynamics within the crab. There's also a certain amount of chance, which is really important. Like, it's not that all the crabs which die off are simply inadequate for their environment. But for example, there's a human there and he stomps on some crabs, and that induces a change also in the environment, so that perhaps the crabs that would not have been able to survive before now are capable of surviving, because there are certain niches empty because the human stomped on them. And this action of human stomping is actually, I think, the same kind of, there's a certain action which happens before there's even any Umwelt to think about, or any virtual self to kind of imagine oneself in. There's just that I mean, also, if we go with this model of virtual selves, one has to presuppose that one can understand them. And that I find really, really problematic, because for me, it seems that I can understand virtual selves only as transformations of my own self. But that transformation is not possible from my own self, but only to technique, one could say. So that the relationship is not, of course it is there, but I'm questioning whether there's an addition of a virtual element, or if there's an intensification of this kind of element of chance, element of just doing things which are kind of, which one can do in several different ways, and in such a way develop technique which is not understood, but enables certain kind of differences which can then kind of sediment into the virtual selves that Sebastjan is talking about. But I find this absolute virtual self a little bit problematic.
Yeah, Isaac, but that's the reason that you find it problematic, because it would seem that somehow you've decided to equate the categories of the actual with the categories of the possible. The dynamics of virtual selves is not the dynamics of actual self. You know, or if I use something that is more up your alley, the structure of the horizon is not the same as the structure of the, what is it, leak, no?
Shape?
Gestalt?
No. You have a on the background. What's the
figure?
The figure, yeah. So the structure of the figure is not the same as the structure of the horizon. So the possible virtual selves that are on your horizon are not necessarily fully developed in the sense that you would have a complete knowledge of them or something like that, but they are given to you as certain possibilities wherein you can kind of in as directions or pools in which you can go. And it's I would disagree with what you said in the first example. So you said you act out a certain character, and it is only then that this character, yeah, this may happen, but this only happens in specific situations. For example, you don't even know that in a certain part in your life you've been actually enacting your father, or you've been enacting a certain character. Okay, that's a legitimate point. But here's the crucial thing: at a certain point you realize this, and this might affect you very profoundly. And you find yourself in a place when you kind of become aware of what you previously have just been enacting. And what happens then? Reflection allows you to start thinking about, what are the possibilities? What can I do differently? And it's not like they're completely laid out in the sense that, you know, this is one model that you can buy, this is the other model that you can buy. No, they're given to you more like as hints or as certain feelings or whatnot. Or you might even not know what exactly it is, but you have a certain tension that kind of shows in a certain direction. So what do? You start writing. You start writing, and by doing stuff, you are basically tinkering in your virtual world, and things become more manifest. Or what you might do is you might be so completely baffled or so completely in agony or in anxiety that you simply start enacting something and you see what happens then. So there is definitely this push and pull. I agree with you. But the way you can do it in very different ways. You don't necessarily have to live it. You can maybe start writing. You can maybe start playing music. You know, there is maybe a certain sense of malaise or whatnot that starts you to get to do meditation, even though you don't get it. So you do meditation, and then you kind of enter onto a certain path, and a certain something becomes more embedded, more concrete, gets more fleshed out, and so on and so forth. So there is a difference between virtual selves and actual self, or between the category of the possible and the category of the actual. So one of the problems, I think, of many philosophical approaches is that they try to think possible in light of classical, actual. And this is something you somehow try to did as well. You kind of assume that when I talk about virtual, I already have these fully designed selves in front of me, as if I entered a store and there was somebody who would tell me, you see, this is what you could be. This is your alternative. This is not the case. The realm of possibility is very much the realm of the implicit. It is the realm of the ambiguous. It is the realm of the behavioral. So, but the behavioral in human beings is no longer pertaining to strictly actual. It is something that is related to the virtual, to the possible. Yeah, so this is what I'm kind of, and of course there is a specific horizon, and the notion itself is problematic because, you know, you can kind of stretch this horizon to all the life forms that are out there. Yes, but in your specific situation, there is a meaningful horizon for you of certain possible modifications. And you may start enacting some of them, or something that has a vague appeal to you. And then you kind of, first of all, see that the way you were presenting it, this to yourself was completely different, and it might take you in a different track. Or when it starts to unfold, you realize that it's very different. So, you know, you do have to undergo this change. You have to die in a certain, so your actual self has to die in order for the possibility to manifest itself. Does this, I mean, I wasn't, you know, when I was talking about virtual self, I wasn't thinking like this is a mental gymnastics where you kind of perform combinations on already fully formed possible selves in the sense of having them in front of you as possibilities, you know. This is not how I imagine it.
Sorry. I think you partly answered my question as well. I'm quite satisfied with your answer, but still, I think I'm curious what this means for your conception of the actual self. Like, does it? What might that even be like? Like when you were talking before, I also pictured like you have a kind of set of possible actual selves or beings, out of which some sort of metacognition picks and chooses, right, according to circumstances in which it puts them, which is like, this is altogether false. I mean, not your idea, I guess. But then, like, would you say, and before when you were talking about, I have a problem with the notion of Umwelt as such, because it presupposes that the animal isn't capable of learning, isn't capable of like as if it's in a fixed state of the possibilities according to which it can perceive and act on the world. And maybe it is a lot more rigid than human beings, but wouldn't it be more like accurate to think in terms of like a continuum of plasticity, like regarding the relation between the animal and the person, the human being, right? Like it's what you're talking about sounds more like your conception of the virtual sounds like like plasticity, like just being aware that you are able to undergo transformations in your basic cognitive practical abilities, but there's like an intrinsic impossibility of knowing where you will end up, like all the possible states you could embody. And this is, I think, what Isaac meant when he said that it's more of a kind of a becoming than like a set of like thinking of a set of possible states. Like, does that make sense?
I think it does. I would just I wouldn't want to underestimate the importance of a pause. So there's basically this ability to pause. I think that this is, if somebody asks me, the more I think about it, somebody asks me what is at the core of mind at its most general, I would say that this is it. This is the ability to pause, the ability to kind of just, in a certain sense, step back. And what is given to you is not necessarily a panoramic view of what's happening and fully fledged possibilities, but it's just this moment where you see how different realities are born, so to speak, both the world you live in and the self that you are. And this ability to pause, this is something that is extremely, extremely valuable. This is something that I think is crucial. This is what allows you to situate yourself in this realm of what I call the virtual. And once you situate yourself there, you also see the arising and passing of the world, so to speak. But this is becoming very mystical very quickly. I apologize for that. So your final, your point was, Timothy, what was the final point that you said towards the end?
I mean, the general point was that you couldn't, how I would picture this, the realm of the virtual would be like having an awareness that you could be transformed in the general kind of structure of your practical and cognitive abilities, but that you cannot actually have a clear conception of what that structure, of how that structure might change in advance. Like you cannot have these virtual selves like gathered up in a kind of a set before your eyes, so to say.
Yeah. That's I would agree with that completely. What you can do is you can enter into this, situate yourself into this realm or what have you, where what happens is this, what I've said, where these worlds are born and pass away. What I mean by that is that you see how different attitudes co-arise with different realities you're in and vice versa. And even though you don't necessarily see everything or whatnot, you can cultivate this. And as you cultivate this, the more the more skillful you are in this, in also seeing these interrelations and whatnot. So what you can do is you can not necessarily just enact the dynamics of the living, but you can somehow pause in it and see how it unfolds. And this is tremendously useful for these shifts. Now, what is really important, and I don't really know how to fully articulate, is this. This is not a classically Cartesian notion, of a thinker who is kind of performing calculations on well-defined ideas. So the mind, in the way I understand it, goes a bit deeper. So the notion of mind is deeper as it is construed in say in early modern philosophy, and which has somehow then become like the standard view of what the mind is. So the mind here would be something that is more profound, and is, in this sense, it is closer to what Isaac was trying to point out, and what also you, Timothy, were trying to point out. So it's not a, again, you're not in a store where you're buying models of cars, and you don't have a set of all the properties of this, and then you simply say, well, this is what I want to be. This is good. Because you sometimes don't even know what good is. You kind of have just the impression with regards to where you are as to where you're kind of driven to, or there is a certain pulsation to, you know, where this goes. And then after a while, if you go through several of these processes, you kind of can maybe gain an insight into what would be the optimal attitude that you might take with regards to any possible breakdowns of your world happening. So this is going as deep as you can, you know. It's not just how do I solve a certain problem, how do I create a more beneficial reality, but how do I engage with this ongoing pattern of changing selves and changing realities. So this would be the profoundest level of wisdom, I would say.
Yeah, but
actually, sorry.
No, you need to say it.
Yeah, actually, I still see kind of a problem here, because what is really, I mean, in my practice as a cellist, what is really important, of course, you have kind of a figure. For example, let's say, so the color, the shape of your sound is the figure, and you can manipulate this figure kind of by allowing the horizon, for example, the echo in a specific room, to influence in what way you kind of enact the shape of the sound. So if you want to learn to play really, really softly, you go into a really loud room, but you're not really aware of this room as such, but it provides a horizon within which you can train this absolute, this really soft way of playing. Or you go into a room where it's really hard to play forte, so loud. And basically what you do is not concentrate on the room as such, but rather concentrate on the sound. And because you're in such a situation, you can influence your development of sound so that it kind of, it changes. But what is even more, this is how I could apply what you said just now to my own practice. But what is more important for me is actually that the kind of the constitution of this of this kind of virtual approach within you, with which you can grab onto the horizon, because to me there's something behind it. Namely, as you said, you really don't know what is good and what is bad, and you arrive at those kind of categorical judgments only by interacting with other people. So only by interacting with other people you can perform kind of you can ask about certain aspects of your playing, for example, the color of your sound, the diversity of intensities, as I just described them, because somebody says, "Oh, your playing is not really diverse enough," and then you start thinking, "Okay, so my playing is not diverse enough." And actually, when you first approach, it seems very diverse to you. You see it as a very diverse, and you don't want to actually tweak it. But the more you listen, the more you start to listen also to others, the more it appears as inconsistent, not inconsistent, but not full enough. And then you start experimenting with these things, and by then you do some steps, and you arrive at a certain kind of technical situation where you can manipulate your surroundings so as to develop the figure you're trying to develop. But what I find really crucial here is that these surroundings are not so, they don't arise by themselves, right? It's not that you are thrown into a situation and you immediately know all the ways you can develop. But when you try to develop in these ways, new hidden dynamics approach your constitution of meaning, which are not even, they're completely hidden, one could say. So, for example, a really good example would be when you draw a ball on a string instrument. It's not so much that you can feel the the bow going up and down, as it is, you can feel all the joints moving in a certain weird passive direction, which is really as if at the same time the bow was the part of your arm implicitly of your body, but at the same time the arm became an object, so that you manipulate the arm as if it were an object, so that you kind of use all the physical characteristics of the arm to influence the passivity of interacting with the implicit bow. So that there's this kind of hidden dynamic which cannot be just discovered as such. It first has to arise by some doing, what could say, so that the dynamic that you are gonna use is not given to you, but rather arises or appears after you have been investigating something, so that it's not a horizon really, it's just a kind of the possibility of a horizon, which I'm trying to explicate now, so that you can have this virtual and you can have actual, and there's this other dimension behind it. And of course, if you go by French philosophy, this is the arche writing by Derrida. But this kind of
this is really, I don't know why you go to him. I mean, precisely what you're saying. You could go to so many more profound traditions, and then you end up with Derrida. I mean, what is that? It's just, I get what you're saying. I would agree with that. This is the level that is the deepest level, I would say, the possibility of the horizon and all that. I agree with that, you know. And it's just that I don't know what to do with arche writing and all that. It's just, this is where I get lost and where we completely separate part. Because for me, this is an entryway into where true philosophy as a practice, as a life, is done. And for you, it's something very different, it would seem.
Yeah, because you're not the one that constructs the spaces within which you play. You're not the one that writes the pieces that you play. You're not the one that constructs the physical characteristics and the chemical properties of your organs. You can, of course, enact them, but the possibility of you enacting them is conditioned by something that is not given to you, that is kind of predetermined. So it's not you cannot situate yourself as the actual subject which interacts with the virtual selves without understanding that the environment within you do this is also pre-structured in such a way that you are capable of constructing this relation, because we're not just thrown into the woods and done like that, but the kind of the structural characteristics of the possibility of horizon come before you as a individual.
Okay.
Perhaps we can return a little closer to Canguilhem. One thing which I've been thinking about now while trying to follow your trains of thought is how, if you look at the way mental illnesses are classified today, for something to be really a mental illness, it has to, in a way, prevent a person from functioning normally in society or something like that, the way I understand it. And isn't that actually, in a way, the same as Canguilhem defines abnormality? Basically, when a creature, when an organism can no longer establish its normativity. And I think, like, in mental illness, we do sort of take this kind of approach in contemporary society, in contemporary psychiatry, whereas in like the rest of medicine, we look at it more like statistical anomalies. To classify something as a disease, it has to be sort of statistically anomalous from some kind of given ideal type. So yeah, I think it's interesting that a part of medicine, so psychiatry, does take this kind of approach, which Canguilhem, I think, in part advocates, whereas medicine in general has kind of stuck with the old Comte Broussais approach. I don't know if anyone had any thoughts about that, or if I made sense. guess not.
No, you made sense. Basically, you said the whole story almost. I think that in with psychiatric diseases, it's way more difficult to pull off the impression that you can simply ignore the normative part, right? That you can simply just like do the statistical analysis and just, there is a tendency to do that for sure, but it's not as easily done. I think that's probably one of the reasons. But with this move towards the neuropsychiatry, it's becoming more and more. So this attempt to make psychiatric diseases basically into brain diseases.
Mm-hmm.
This is an interesting battlefield, I think, in contemporary medicine. It's a very, very active debate, this attempt to neurologize. And by doing so, it would be easier to pull that off, I think, Primož, you know.
Yeah, and it's what's happening basically. So we're regressing in a way.
From the Canguilhemian perspective,
Yeah.
From the Comtean perspective, we're moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. But for example, if you take, I don't know, for example, depression, if we take it as a kind of illness, and in this Canguilhemian sense as a kind of abnormality, so it would mean that a depressed person finds it difficult to establish its own normativity. And I think you could take that to a societal level, and where, you know, depression is supposedly increasing amounts of depression among people. The statistics are very negative. And isn't that basically a kind of a sign that ours as a society, as if we look back at Goldstein, who actually opened up this point of looking at nature on a very macro level, not just on the level of the individual, but as a society, we seem to be in a state of abnormality, in which humans find it very difficult to establish their normativity. And so you have this constant sense of chaos, and Nietzsche killing the god and everything. And I think you can sort of link that to this very basic vital normativity, and just see this manifestation on a societal level as well. I guess Foucault would like that.
Interesting question about living in a diseased society. It's what Fromm says, that if you're a healthy person in the diseased society, you're bound to be proclaimed diseased, pathological. Yeah, so I don't know. I would really like to hear some other people's views on this. I'm developing fairly grim views as of late with regards to the society and everything. So they're becoming progressively grimmer. Maybe if somebody has like something to say about this, I think it's a valid question.
I think I'd like to answer, because I think the thing you have to read is on the page 144. He says that there is no fact which is normal or pathological in itself. I think this here is strange to me, maybe because not strange in your case, in the case of social issues of depression and other psychological diseases or pathological states. I think this is weird because it's like I think the problem is the environment is the environment for a human is the same environment. I think that seems to me the problem. I think like this vital normativity, I think it applies I don't know. It seems to me like it applies too much on this basic idea. Maybe I have a basic idea of the relationship between animals and nature and the environment. I think human is in a much more complicated situation. It seems to me like you're making the decision of what's normal and what's not. The human itself is making the decision of what's normal and what's not. It's not like it's clear that it's not, that it is not normal, because what I'm trying to say is that because
Yeah, but Mattia, is it completely contingent? Would you say that, you know, and even if this is true, is it what? Is it what the individual human being creates as a normality or as a society, and are just norms that you find yourself in completely contingent and don't really have any meaning whatsoever aside from being sediments of earlier power structures or something like that?
yeah, I don't know, but because I was thinking about that also, about depression and stuff, but I wanted to explain it in another way, because I just wanted to say before that I was thinking in a bit more shallow way than Sebastjan was when I was talking about the virtual selves. I think this was a way to maybe if I try to explain, I will be brief. I promise. Because I was thinking exactly about depression. Because a virtual self would be making a new normativity inside the normativity already established. I think I would say you act as a depressed person, you write poems, and in this way, as a depressed person, you make yourself another normativity on top of a normativity that sort of sweeps away the underlying normativity, though the underlying normativity still exists, the vital normativity, as if maybe you would start smoking, yes, and that would be bad for you, and you would eventually die, because maybe if you smoke in your room and the environment gets filled up with smoke, you die, and that's but if you think about it as a depressed person who writes poems, you smoke as if this is your new normativity. It brings you a new dynamic to the relationship between environment and your virtual self. It's like it's normative that you smoke, that you write poems, that you're depressed, and this is what makes a normativity. And I think normativity is essentially a functional vital normativity, or the virtual normativity, let's call it. It's just a functional relationship between your environment and yourself in that environment. Because if your environment makes you depressed, if everyone else around you makes you depressed, even if you are yourself who makes you yourself depressed, and then you write poems about that, and you smoke, I guess, and or something like that, you establish a new normativity which makes it fine, and it establishes a new relation between the environment and yourself, and this is what I was talking about, not something. I mean, maybe we can go, if you experience different virtual realities, virtual selves, let's call them like that, like this one, maybe you can then realize that you can apply different kinds of ways of making relation to the environment and yourself in a way that would establish a concrete, a perfect relation. It's something like that. I think it's not that bad, and I think I tried it before.
Does it really make it fine? Like smoking and writing poems, does it make it fine, this new normativity? Because I think the exact thing that happens is that, and I think depression is basically is the mental state of someone who is chronically unable to establish some kind of a productive normativity for themselves. And sure, okay, you wrote a poem, okay, you smoked a cigarette, you kind of added some romance to the depression, but you're not fine. Your norm is still not really working for you.
I don't think no, because I think that is productive for you. That's how you live your life then. Now this is a new normativity for you, and the normativity you want to establish it is something that works for you, I think. I think I will try to think of some example of someone, but I don't think I'll find it. I was thinking about Kafka in this example. I was reading some of his letters to some girl he had, and and I think there might be an example for this productive new normativity.
At least I think. What about the example of Sylvia Plath, for instance?
I don't know much about Sylvia Plath.
Okay, she was a brilliant poet. She suffered from depression, like a heavy bouts of depression, and some of her poems about depression are probably the best expressions in the poetic language of the feeling of being on the verge of killing yourself. And she did eventually kill herself. So she was kind of having these, she became a poet, she lived like a poet in many ways. Then she ended up killing herself. So, how is this, I get what you're saying. So it's one thing to establish some sort of a normativity, but, as Canguilhem would say, there are suboptimal and there are superoptimal normativities. And by you committing a suicide, I mean, this is a very a reductio ad absurdum of the way of life you chose to live.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe maybe I think we should talk about it, but I don't. For everyone else, of course, it's something horrible, but I don't know. I mean, suicide. Maybe I will stop.
You always try to find some kind of normativity, and so even smoking and being really edgy and depressed and on the bed and writing poems is a kind of normativity which makes your life, your existence possible, but it's not really an optimal kind of existence, and you as an individual might simply not survive this kind of normativity. It might not be good in the long term. But I guess this might be sort of similar to when he talks about evolution. So how some things which can be abnormal in a certain context, for example, can be bad for the organism. But then when maybe the environment changes, it eventually sort of accommodates the organism. And in a similar way, I guess you can transform these depressive kinds of normativities towards something more positive. But I don't think the state of depression itself is the positive kind of, the bearable kind of normativity. I think you need this transcendence at some point.
Yeah, but I think I was just trying to say that I think that human has this possibility that he can or he or she can form this new type of normativity as opposed to other beings who can't. I think, I don't know, I wouldn't want to say that the dog can establish a new normativity of depression and start laying around like maybe he does, I don't know, but I don't think so.
Can't it? Like a dog who goes through trauma and then after some therapy it eventually recovers its positive normativity?
Actually, I think it's an important problem. We could touch on an important problem, at least to me, it seems, the problem of flexibility of normativity. Because if one takes radically this kind of that normativity is not just an establishment of norm, but of being capable of interacting in different environments and expressing variety of environmental norms in that sense, then one also has to ask in what way the environment is capable of kind of supporting the differences, these expressions and changes in norms, and to what it's not. Because one could say that the depressed person, I mean, to me, I don't see an avenue where on which I could think and not end up with Foucault, like it's just up to the environment to if I start from this flexibility. Because one thing is to be flexible with your norms. The other thing is that this flexibility is not it's not all powerful. There has to be a certain environment through which you can kind of express a new norm. So you cannot, a person who has just survived cancer treatment can climb Mount Everest, right? So this transition from one normativity to the other is really important. And perhaps one could make the case that actually with the depressed person, this transition is not he's not capable of making this transition, but not because of his kind of also probably because his psychological state, but perhaps also because there are no situations, no environments given to him that are kind of that could include his norm and make kind of enable the establishment of a new norm, the flexibility of a norm.
Yeah, something that comes to mind is like something that Canguilhem says in this chapter, which I found really interesting, is that health isn't a kind of norm. It's not even a set of states, but a possibility of experimenting with new norms. So like health is a possibility of squandering health. Like you have a sort of surplus of, let's say, energy or possible states which you can adopt. And this is health. Like you have like a space of maneuvering. Like this is something I got the association from what we talked about before about virtual cells and stuff like that. And also it kind of links into depression. At least I mean I don't know anything technically like medically about depression, but I've read somewhere like that this you can simply treat depression as a kind of low level. It's not just a bad mood. It's not even a terrible mood. It's also a kind of dampening of your affective structures in general. So you cannot really. The problem isn't that you feel bad. The problem is that you cannot feel anything. You don't have a relation to the world as strongly as a normal, healthy person would. And this is a kind of, you could conceive of this as a kind of rigid psychological state, like a rigidity of this kind of transformation or finding new norms, new ways of being, I could say.
But this kind of what I find important here is that the flexibility or the rigidity of normativity is not simply a consequence of itself, but rather as a function of the environment. So if one doesn't have enough to eat, his vital flexibility of his norms is going to be greatly diminished. In the same way, if one has a really depressing environment around himself, the possibility of getting depressed is going to be much higher. So he seems at the same time to say that the norm and the environment are completely interconnected. But when it comes to normativity is this something intrinsic to the living being, and it is capable of kind of varying its norms. But actually, it's not so easy because the environment itself can introduce certain differences into the normativity. For example, if one doesn't have enough food to eat, then his vital flexibility is going to be greatly diminished, and so his variational possibility is also going to be greatly diminished. So he's now his his normativity got reduced from the outside. So that's what I'm asking, because is the treatment for depression then something like establishing an environment through which the person could arrive at a good normativity, or is it like kind of trying to fix the person in his normativity? And I'm not really sure how Canguilhem approaches this, because there's this ambiguity in the middle of it, to my reading.
I mean, it's an interesting comparison, which I thought about, is between this contemporary treatment of depression as a kind of real, I know, you're a diseased person, something is really wrong with you. It's very much pathologized in current society. And if you compare that to like the Romantic era in the 19th century, where being depressed, Weltschmerz, was sort of fashionable, and it was an not only an okay thing to be, it was an exceptional thing to be depressed and to be so attuned to this. And I wonder, like, if I guess this abnormality kind of understanding of depression is very much contemporary, but if you look at this romantic kind of depression, if you look at Weltschmerz, is that abnormal? Or I mean, because it sort of functioned, I guess, every now and then a Werther killed himself, but for the most part, yeah, I don't know.
One was more of socially flexible, right?
Yeah. And in a way, society accommodated and gave some kind of validity to your feeling. It didn't just pathologize you and basically set you as some kind of a malfunction, which has to be fixed or removed. Well, Sebastjan has left us. Do we have any more passionate topics to discuss? I guess we could always find something, but I guess it's 8 o'clock. So if no one has anything else to say.
Actually, I just had a question. I read it a little bit differently than Sebastjan, namely that I didn't understand norms as ideals. So as ideal norms, I would say they're kind of in between ideal and habitual. As Timothée said already, that there's certain flexibility, and I don't really know how much ideal concepts. I don't know if normativity would be a concept or norm would be a concept, but let's say how much ideal norm would be capable of its flexibility, of its normativity. But perhaps I just
I mean, the way I see it is like you have this, I mean, he puts it in this ideal terms, but that's just kind of I see it as a kind of a surface effect. Like you get the statistical regularities as a kind of a surface effect of a deeper mechanism that you have to get, that you have to grasp in order to really understand what's going on. Like, why is it actively sustaining those specific states? Like you could say, yes, it does. It maintains itself in a set of parameters that sustain its organization, and that's all fine. But that's just the surface effect. Like you have to understand the specific mechanism. Like this is my take on it. Like here, I would find like this very much related to like cybernetic and autopoietic theories about homeostasis, about autopoiesis, let's say, where you could actually grasp like why a kind of certain system structures itself and its environment in certain ways. But without this kind of account, I find it, yes, just like it seems like an ideal norm that doesn't have anything to do with it. I mean, it seems just like something like it doesn't seem satisfactory on its own to me, let's say.
Because I would even say that but perhaps I'm completely wrong here, that it's not an ideal thing, the norm. It's something completely other, that it's more habitual actually, in this sense.
I would agree there.
It's the kind of the optimal anomaly of certain physiological or morphological stuff in an organism that's just by chance suffices for its life in an environment. It's not the ideal thing.
Yeah, I guess, what does it really mean to be an ideal type? The way I understood it is some kind of a, I don't know, conceptual structure which a scientist basically constructs, I don't know, maybe based on observations, based on statistical averages, but like living things in this primordial sense, just living, don't really do this. They're more attuned to the habits they have, the way they're able to really execute their habits, their life. So yeah, I agree. Noch etwas?
There might be one interesting example of the biological, of kind of subcellular technique. So you have these chaperone, please, if I'm wrong, biologists, please correct me, but you have the chaperone systems which carry out the correct, they carry out the correct folding of proteins. And basically, I just 2 weeks ago read an article which said that basically they're the first regulators of mutations, so that basically you can have certain mutations in the genome, which would, without the chaperone systems, induce a wrongly shaped false protein. But because there's chaperone systems which force a protein to fold in a certain way, these mutations don't really come out so much. But when an organism is exposed to really abnormal situations, for example, high heat or something like that, the chaperone system starts to malfunction, and the mutations all of a sudden arise out of nothing. They start to be kind of adaptively important, so that the selection then doesn't happen like from generation to generation, but there's this a kind of gathering of potential kind of mutations, which then happen all of a sudden, and then these mutations survive and perhaps constitute new adaptations later on, when the chaperone system, of course, lets mutates in such a way that it provides this this new shape of the protein. Just, I thought it was interesting. So will we finish now, or just
unless
be silent?
You have more. Yeah, I think we can call it a night, and I don't know when the next time is. But anyway, it was a good talk. Have a good evening.
You too. Bye.
See you.